COVID-19, starting with the health of our people through availability of vaccines and ensuring the health of our economies by promoting economic and trade policies that strengthen our recovery. These include measures which allow women and small businesses to thrive, promote a gradual reduction in our carbon emissions, and encourage our tech and gaming firms to compete globally. APEC has always prioritised making trade easier and faster, and that's never been more important for goods and the people who manufacture, ship, buy and sell them. But that's not all. From the outset, we collectively recognised that our recovery needs to be sustainable, prioritising policies that mean we can grow our economies greener and accelerating trade that benefits our environment. COVID recovery is also about inclusion, and so a significant part of our work has been to ensure the potential of groups such as women and Indigenous people is being supported and realised. And whilst we have joined together differently in APEC 2021, connecting virtually has also enabled greater flexibility. For the first time, in addition to the annual summit, we held an APEC informal leaders retreat with a focus firmly on our COVID response. And we've been working up an action plan to realise our collective vision for an open, dynamic, resilient and peaceful Asia-Pacific community by 2040. Well, everyone, as you can see, together we've achieved an extraordinary amount in an extraordinary year. There's plenty of work to do, but there are clear plans to achieve our goals going forward. Thank you for being part of APEC 2021 as we've joined, worked, grown together.
Haumie, huie, taekie.
No mai, haere mai, and welcome to this media conference following the APEC ministerial meeting. Great to have you with us today. Thanks for being here. Now, in the early hours of this morning, New Zealand time, ministers completed their second night of virtual meetings, and you would have seen the statement released after those discussions. We're now going to hear from the co-chairs of the meeting, New Zealand Minister of Foreign Affairs, Nanaia Mahuta, and Minister of Trade and Export Growth, Damien O'Connor. Great to have you both with us today. Now, both ministers will answer your questions, but first we'll hear from them for some of their reflections. And we'll begin with Minister Mahuta for an overview of these discussions, and in particular, APEC's work to build a sustainable and inclusive economy. Kia ora, Minister.
E te ti e te tā, tēnā koutou katoa. Good afternoon. Early this morning, we completed the 33rd APEC ministerial meeting. It was an important opportunity for ministers around the region to take stock on what has been achieved this year and set the scene for the discussion APEC leaders will have later this week. Our meeting represents the culmination of 8 APEC ministerial meetings during Aotearoa's New Zealand's host year. These meetings have run the full range of issues important to APEC and Aotearoa New Zealand. Under our leadership, ministers have agreed a roadmap on the food security of our region, championed economic reform that is inclusive and sustainable, and continued to work towards greater women's economic empowerment as we respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. Ministers also discussed the importance of promoting a low emissions, climate resilient future for the region. We heard from the chair of the Pacific Islands Forum, Prime Minister Bainimarama, and from the United Nations Framework on Climate Change. As a leading regional body, it is important that APEC continues to emphasise its strong support for global climate commitments. While APEC accounts for 60% of global GDP, the same percentage is also true for emissions. We know that there is a role for APEC to play in combating climate change. It was for this reason that ministers agreed to send a strong signal on the importance of halting further spending on fossil fuel subsidies. These subsidies cost our economies billions of dollars a year, but their real impact is on our environment. Ministers also recognise that an inclusive economy is a resilient and sustainable economy. A true economic recovery from COVID-19 is one where women and Indigenous peoples are able to maximise their economic inclusion for the betterment of the region. Aotearoa New Zealand has amplified the voice of Indigenous peoples and their knowledge amongst our economies this year, and I'm proud of that. A virtual year has seen more Indigenous peoples at the APEC table than ever before, connecting, sharing and contributing to improved health, economic and trade outcomes for their communities, a trend which we will continue beyond 2021. This work sets the scene for the meeting of APEC leaders later this week, where we expect leaders to lay out a plan that spans the next 2 decades, with the work and values discussed here today helping to guide it. Tēnā koutou.
Kia ora, Minister. Thank you for those remarks and a lot of anticipation for that leaders meeting later in the week. Over to Minister O'Connor now for an update on the trade discussions. Morena.
Morena. Kia ora. It was a real honour to co-chair the APEC ministerial meeting and connect again with my fellow ministers from around the region. In this meeting, ministers reiterated APEC's strong stance against vaccine nationalism. We all know that none of us are safe until we are all safe. It was heartening to hear that no APEC economy has introduced vaccine export restrictions since we discussed a shared response to vaccine nationalism back in June. 17 APEC economies have either lowered or completely removed tariffs on vaccines and related products, making them easier to access. I was particularly pleased that ministers emphasised the importance of the World Trade Organization and again called for the conclusion of fisheries subsidies negotiations and an end to harmful agricultural subsidies. As we heard, as we head into the WTO ministerial meeting in December, chaired by Director General Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who also attended the APEC ministerial meeting, APEC ministers are committed to the success of the meeting and to delivering concrete results. It is free, fair and open trade that will help economies move forward out of this pandemic. With APEC comprising 47% of global trade, we need openness in our region to drive global growth. Indeed, it is trade that presents the solution to our challenges. Some 81 million jobs have been lost across the region due to COVID-19, and the impact on supply chains has been significant. But APEC members have rejected protectionism during this crisis. Most APEC economies this year have embedded paperless trading as a permanent feature, cutting the cost to New Zealand exporters of border procedures, not just for this year, but into the future. This has gone hand in hand with recognising the importance of a digital future for the region's economy. Our need to connect in a time when physical connections became constrained has forced our economies to digitise at pace. A fully virtual APEC of 2021 has set the backdrop for an unprecedented digitisation of our economies, and APEC has front-footed those conversations this year. Minister Mahuta and I now look forward to taking your questions. Kia ora.
Thank you, Minister. Yes, let's go straight to questions now. And a reminder, if I call on you to ask a question, please make sure that your camera is turned on, unmute yourself, ask your question, and then mute yourself once again. We're going to try and get through as many questions as we can in this session. And we'll begin with some questions from the New Zealand media who are attending this media conference in person. Now, if you're joining us virtually, you will hear the question from our media representative here in the room, but you won't see the speaker on screen. So let's begin with our first question, which comes from Sam Suchdeva from Newsroom.
Kia ora. A question to both ministers. In its report to APEC leaders, the APEC Business Advisory Council recommended that economies agree on not requiring vaccination as a precondition for travel within the region. given that New Zealand and other economies are moving towards and not away from vaccine mandates, was that recommendation discussed by APEC ministers? And what are your thoughts on whether that would be viable to agree not to require vaccination?
Look, thank you for the question. There's a number of challenging issues when it comes to vaccine mandates for travel, and each economy considering those circumstances as it applies to them. But to give you a sense of the nature of the challenge in economic terms, 1.2 trillion is lost in output across the APEC region. So it's an issue significantly important to each of the economies. We remain very much engaged in terms of what the decisions may well be across those various economies and aligned to that.
Thank you, Minister. Our next question comes from Praveen Menon from Reuters. Please ask your question.
Hi. My question is about America hosting the 2023 APEC. Did this come up in any of the ministerial discussions, and is there a consensus on this?
APEC as an institution is founded on collaboration and also consensus. What I will say is that both America and Peru have offered to host the 2023 and 2024 APEC Forum respectively, yet there is no confirmed host, and we are hopeful that we will get there.
Okay, off to our first virtual question now, which comes from Ching Ting Jung from the 21st Century Business Herald. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Kia ora. Could you explain on the necessity of expanding the current APEC list of environmental goods, in addition to improving market access for environmental goods? What other options have been discussed in order to support green growth? Kia ora.
Kia ora. Look, I think APEC can take great pride that in 2012 they developed an environmental goods list. It was 54 goods. Since that time, of course, the world has moved on and had a greater focus on the value of trade in environmental goods and services. And so we provided, the base from which discussion has occurred right across the globe, understanding the importance of developing that list further, expanding it out, as I say, to be goods and services. That was confirmed through statements from APEC. All our economies are committed to expanding that, but the final list has not moved beyond that at this point. But we are confident that actually it will be goods and services and environmental trade that actually assists us, particularly in the areas of climate change that we need to progress.
Thank you, Minister. Over to Australia now. We're going to hear from Anthony Galloway from the Sydney Morning Herald. Good morning, Anthony.
Good morning, Ministers. I was wondering if I could ask about one of the talking points which has been going on the sidelines of APEC, and that's Taiwan's bid to join the CPTPP. Was wondering if New Zealand can say whether it supports Taiwan's bid to join that trade pact, and also if you could comment on China's wish to join it as well.
Look, we, as members of CPTPP, have always been open to accession by applicants. I think we've all welcomed the applications by UK, by China, and by Chinese Taipei. That's a separate process. Not all APEC members are part of CPTPP, and so that wasn't a core part of discussions. But nonetheless, as a trade and economic forum, all the economies would welcome the greater movement and the reduction of any barriers. CPTPP provides that, but accession requests do mean that those applicants will have to look at the standards required to ultimately become members and be accepted.
Thank you, Minister. Our next question comes from Lu Huai Chien from Xinhua. Please unmute yourself and ask a question. Lu Huai Chien, can you hear me? Okay, we will move on to... Oh, you can hear me? Go ahead.
Jack Lu with Xinhua News Agency. My question for Mr. O'Connor, just like you just said, digital is the key to boost the recovery after pandemic, where New Zealand, China just applied to join the DEPA on the way to economic recovery. how should we boost the digital cooperation in the APEC region? Thank you very much.
Digitization, as I said, was a core part of progress for APEC economies. The acknowledgement of that through all our statements. DEPA is an open plurilateral agreement, or it's an initiative from members. We're open, as I say, to those who want to apply. Again, it will be up to applicants to meet the standards that we have agreed to. They are high standards, and they, in terms of DEPA, do require protections around privacy, open access, and so all and any members applying to accede to that will have to acknowledge the requirements and the changes that might be necessary within their own economies.
Thank you, Minister. Our next question comes from SBS. Shubha Krishnan, please ask your question.
The UN has said that rich countries need to help vaccinate poor countries before turning to booster shots. What efforts have been made to accelerate the vaccination of some nations that are lagging behind? And in places like PNG, where it's not actually supply that's the issue, but vaccine hesitancy and the spread of misinformation, was there any discussion around efforts to sort of counter that?
The statement from the MRT clearly laid out the obligations on us all to try and remove any barriers to the movement of vaccines and medical equipment, to go to MC12 in Geneva and to make the changes necessary, be that through a TRIPS waiver to ensure that there is sufficient vaccine available. Members of APEC, of course, have been large donors to ensure that some of the developing countries have access to sufficient vaccine. Clearly, we've got some way to go, and we have to keep working hard in this area. But I think all APEC members are committed to ensuring that all of us have access to vaccine. We can't be safe until everyone goes through that process and has access to it.
Our next question comes from Eva Corlett at The Guardian. Kia ora, Eva.
Kia ora, kōrua. Apologies for some of the background noise. I have a question on behalf of my Australian colleagues, also on the CPTPP. How does New Zealand characterise China's compliance with global trading rules? And to what extent do you agree with the Australian government that China has deployed economic coercion against Australia? And how much will that factor into the stance New Zealand takes when considering Beijing's application to join the CPTPP?
Look, those matters weren't, as was pointed out by my colleague, Minister O'Connor, the subject of conversations during the APEC forum, primarily because not all APEC economies are signatories to the CPTPP, so there wasn't a lot of discussion around that issue.
Okay, our next question comes from right here in the room, over to Te Okiwa McLean from Te Karere.
Kia ora, I have a question to both ministers, but firstly in te reo kia koe Nanaia. Hea ha te hua o tēnei kaupapa ki te iwi Māori o tira, hea ha te take kua roa te tatari kia whakamānawa tia te ohana iwi take.
O nā runga I te hiahia o mātou, tō mātou nei kāwanatanga, tēnei te wā tuatahi kia kuhu mai nā tirohanga o te iwi take e pāna ki ngā mahi ohanga. Nō reira, kua whakaarohia mā Rachel Tauleili e arihi e rā o ngā kaupapa I raro I te maru o APEC, kia kuhu mai I ngā Pākehi I roto I tērā wāhanga ki te whiriwhiri I ngā kaupapa, me ngā painga me ngā hua, mena ka uru mai I ngā ohanga o te ao iwi take ki tēnei o ngā taumata. He wā tuatahi tēnei.
And why is this good for Māori, Minister O'Connor, and why has it taken this long to acknowledge Indigenous economies?
APEC has been an incredibly successful forum. Over the 30 years, we've seen 1 billion people pulled out of poverty. It's assisted most of the people through our economies, but we've acknowledged that we have to try harder in areas of inclusion. And clearly COVID has impacted adversely, particularly on women, on Indigenous groups. And so the opportunities through trade are there for Indigenous people, but also for the wider community. So we hope that building opportunities will provide the success and growth for Indigenous peoples throughout all member economies.
And this is the first time that Indigenous peoples' perspectives have been raised within an APEC context. 270 million Indigenous people sit across APEC economies. And so New Zealand took the opportunity as host to steer through a new and emerging conversation around inclusive economic recovery, but also around sustainability, because both of those perspectives are very much aligned to the Indigenous aspiration and how they participate in economic reform within their own country, but also the new economic opportunities across the region.
Kia ora, Minister. Our next question comes from Nick Perry from the Associated Press. Nick.
Thank you very much. This is a question for both ministers on the rising tension between China and some of the other APEC members, including Hong Kong, Taiwan, the US, Australia, New Zealand. Are you seeing some of those tensions in your discussions so far? And is it realistic for China to remain a member of APEC?
Look, APEC is primarily a trade and economic forum, and much of the conversations are very much based, as I said earlier, on collaborative and consensus building around common aspirations. If we go to where those common aspirations are, where all economies have contributed, I think, productively and positively on what we can do, it has been in this host year, because New Zealand has really tried to ensure that APEC and the fora that we hold centre itself around practical responses to a global pandemic and to climate change. And in both those areas, all economies have participated with the type of, I think, focus that we require to get through this very difficult and challenging time, China included.
I mean, APEC is a voluntary forum for member economies that want to share an aspiration for a better future. We've proven that can be successful by coordinating and collaborating in the areas where we agree. There will always be differences between some of the member economies, but those differences are left for other fora. And in terms of APEC, we've made huge progress in the areas, and they are significant, where we all align. We want to build back better. We want an inclusive growth agenda. And I think we've proven that through the statements that can be ambitious. And I think we've contributed as the chair economy to the progress this year.
Another virtual question now from Fran O'Sullivan from the New Zealand Herald. Morena, Fran.
Good morning. Thank you, Ministers. I take you back to your comments about the tension between China and the United States, and also the fact that CPTPP, that you are seeing increased interest from there. But you also, in your statement, talk about advancing the APEC free trade area of the Asia Pacific, the FTAC. What concretely will you do to advance that? And what also will you do to bring the United States back to the table, which has been a recalcitrant when it comes to regional deals?
I mean, the US economy is at the table through APEC, and we've committed to not raise trade barriers, to reduce them wherever possible, and to facilitate and promote the free movement of goods and services, particularly, firstly, around vaccines and, of course, COVID-related health issues. But of course, beyond that, into environmental goods and services. So all member economies are committed to what is substantial progress in trade that may not align with FTAs, that may be more detailed, but I think APEC has proved its value as a forum to get a huge part of the global economy moving in the right direction.
Over to Amanda Hodge now from The Australian. Good morning, Amanda.
Oh, good morning. I'm sorry, like my Australian colleagues, I'm going to press the point on the CPTPP again. Jacinda Ardern, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern had said she'd be happy for China to join that agreement if it met minimum requirements. Given the high standard this agreement has set on issues like freedom of data flows, labour, and the elimination of all forms of forced labour, I'm interested in what would China need to do in New Zealand's eyes to satisfy such standards? Like, for instance, would it have to disband its alleged re-education camps for Uyghurs in Xinjiang? Would it have to end what's widely regarded as its economic coercion of Australia?
Look, we're just one of the member economies in CPTPP. It's not for us to judge, and we're not going to prejudge what China might have to change or do. What the members of CPTPP have committed to is to maintaining the high standards that were hard fought, hard won, and I don't think anyone has a view that there should be any movement from those standards. So it's up to the applicant economies to reach the standards that we have set and that we believe work well for us.
Okay, that's all we have time for today. Thank you to our ministers for joining us, and thank you to our media, both here in the room in Wellington and around the world. We appreciate your time and your input. Now, the APEC ministerial meeting has really laid the groundwork for the APEC economic leaders meeting, and that's taking place, as we mentioned, in just 3 days' time. We look forward to seeing you all after that. Until then, mā te wā, see you soon.
Kia ora. APEC 2021 has been an extraordinary journey, delivered in extraordinary times. With the challenges that our economies face, we are firm believers that more than ever, collaboration is required to succeed. This has been our theme for the year. Join, work, grow together. Haumie, huie, taikie. These words describe the collaborative effort our ancestors drew on as they worked together to build our great ocean voyaging vessels called waka. Building a waka required entire communities to work in harmony toward a common goal. Whilst their goal was to build a waka, ours is to rebuild from the worst pandemic we've known. More than ever, working together is required. That same idea of together is expressed in our tohu, or symbol for APEC 2021. Our tohu draws on the concept of ngā haue whā, which translates to the 4 winds. The wind from the north, known as hauraki. The wind from the west, we call hauauru. And from the east is marangai. The wind from the south, we call hautonga. The 4 winds, all from different directions, come together. Ngā haue whā is symbolic of being a meeting place for all peoples, from everywhere, to be unified, to be together, to be connected. For APEC 2021, we welcome our colleagues from the north, from the south,